Russian Roulette, last-minute performance scoring. This paper will focus upon the use of performance scores by the Chinese art group Last Minute Live Art, otherwise known as LMLA, or 最后一分钟现代艺术. It will briefly sketch the context and direction of their work before looking at the 2019 event Russian Roulette and its use of scoring. From this and some additional examples of the group's work, I will elucidate the means and uses they have found to the scoring of performance art within the context of contemporary China. My role within the group is that of curator and occasional artist, which is reflected in this analysis as it focuses upon artistic processes and intercultural performance art. LMLA originated in Nanjing in 2018 with a 2-day festival in the Fine Art Museum of Nanjing University of Arts. And it has since then gone on to present events and workshops within China and Hong Kong. Nanjing itself is the former capital of China, home to over 30 universities, and has a population similar in size to that of London. LMLA is a nomadic group who have held events in art museums, on the street, in abandoned buildings, independent art spaces, and on a number of occasions in the nightclub Mono House, which is where Russian Roulette took place. This here is an introduction to the first LMLA event, which set the tone for those which followed. The Last Minute Live Art Festival does not try to be something that it is not. We did not spend 1 year planning this. LMLA has a distinct aesthetic that foregrounds rather than hides improvisation. The rationale here is that things will be messy anyway, so it's better to not adopt a pretentious front which will inevitably be full of cracks. The model and working method are significantly different to that of Chinese performance art festivals, which often project an air of seriousness, exclusivity, and artistic legitimacy. LMLA tends to be open to outsiders, encourages participation, includes experimental music and film, occupies public space, is young, shows many female artists, is LGBT friendly, international, multilingual, and always finishes with a decent after-party. This is the LMLA team on the street in Nanjing promoting the event Russian Roulette. And here is how the event was initially conceived. Scored event, 4 to 8 participants, each writes a performance score in advance. If necessary, this is introduced by first looking at Fluxus scores and trying a few out. The performance begins with the scores being allocated at random. The artist may get their own, but will probably get someone else's. The first person has no time to prepare. The following artists can use the time to prepare their pieces. All will be somewhat improvised. The scores are shown to the audience at the end. As can be seen, this plan combines both preparation and precision with spontaneity and chaos. One reason that it was designed in this way was to bring the spectator into a living creative process and not only to watch the results of a creative process that had already taken place. The structure threw the artist into something awkward, which required them to think in the moment in order to find solutions. This encouraged empathy between audience and artist, with some spectators offering suggestions and others helping out the artists in a practical way. The main goal of LMLA is to encourage new artists and to make performances, to develop an audience for performance in Nanjing. The priority then is not the presentation of masterpieces, though we do of course try to present interesting and vital work. Russian Roulette resulted in 2 members of the audience later coming forward and proposing their own performances for future events. So in terms of building artistic community, I regard that as a success. The embracing of chaos that is inherent in this structure proved very necessary on a practical level too. 2 of the contributing artists were members of the Shanghai collective Cement Park. They were driving to Nanjing, got caught up in traffic and only arrived during the final performance of the afternoon. We were prepared for such eventualities, however, and when it became clear they were not going to arrive on time, that's about 30 minutes before the start, 2 students from my Performance Studies MA course stepped in and performed in their place. Having already introduced them to scored performances and happenings a few weeks earlier, they were able to make credible interpretations of the score. We have so far considered the improvisatory character of the event, but that which is given and that which is there by design. It's my experience that completely free improvisation often leads to repetition, and then the introduction of rules, and in this case scores, provides the friction which can result in more daring and distinct performances. It's therefore important to also look at how the scores brought structure to the event, and there are a number of levels we can look at this, at how scoring influenced the form of the performances, how the live event as a whole developed a distinct form, and how the process of reception was prolonged through the release of the scores. We'll first consider the individual scores. The individual artists were first shown some Fluxus scores so that they could become familiar with some examples of scored performance and with the concept more generally. This was necessary as there is a different history and understanding of performance art within China. The type of performance that's most widely practiced is intuitive, body-based action art. This is typically understood as beginning with the Stars exhibition in Beijing in 1979, and during the 1980s the form to have emerged in several artist villages across the country. Still to this day, marginalised as a medium of expression, it has to be taught mostly by stealth, as it's prohibited in most art schools. Stay indoors. Take off some clothes so you're wearing a small amount of clothing. Prepare a bucket of paint. Sit on a chair, cover your eyes, let the audience dip any part of their body into the paint. Invite them to touch you with their own pigmented body parts. After the audience is finished, stand up. Still covering your eyes, try to embrace each member of the audience. This score was written by Chinese performance artist Gao Shuyi. When I first received it, it was written in the first person as a plan for a performance and not in the form of a score at all. It still bears some of this character, as both the practice of writing down performance art and of scoring work for others are uncommon in China. It does, however, work as a set of instructions, and the meaning of the piece is to be discovered through the doing of it. The process of producing a score for another to perform obliged the artist to visualize the performance and to think through what its core consisted of, which is to say, which elements were essential to it and which were not. They then had to find words to convey this succinctly. This was a different creative process to that which they were accustomed to, and one which required them to take a more exterior view of their work. Talking to the artists afterwards, I learned that they usually saw the core of their performance as being a feeling, a memory, or associated image which they would then try to find a dynamic form to express. The actions they perform, they told me, are often somewhat improvised and lie at the end of a creative chain. The scores are produced rarely addressed the reader on this level of concept or inspiration, and they instead focused on a set of practical instructions. Those handed scores, which essentially consisted of a sequence of instructions, often encountered the problem of having no clear inner logic or rationale. The approach they took, as I saw it, was to focus on the dynamics of the live event itself and work with the energy that this brought. At its most simplistic, this produced a situation that became likened to a game of dare, but the actions and interpretations were such that all the pieces went significantly further. Perhaps the most striking and common theme to this approach was the amount of audience interaction increased. While the contributors were mostly young artists, i.e. under 25, they nonetheless all had their own style of work and no two scores were the same. The exchanging of scores, therefore, meant that they were often invited to do things they were not accustomed to doing. Perhaps the most obvious difference was gender-based, when men performed women's scores and women men's. Navigating these tensions helps artists both discover and break their own habits. As such, I see the study and performance of classic scores, the writing of original scores and exchanging of them as all having a useful pedagogical role. They help the emerging artist get a broader perspective of their practice. The bullet. There's a tendency in China to keep performance in the aesthetic realm, by which I mean the performance will be judged on the grounds of its art-like qualities and not as a so-called real-life action. Breaking down this invisible barrier that separates art from life is one of the tendencies that can be seen in many Fluxus works and in something which Caprell approaches too, for example in his classic series of essays, The Blurring of Art and Life. A game of Russian roulette is not complete if it does not include a bullet, and it was necessary that the event had at least one which would blur the lines separating art and life. The bullet was provided with the performance Go Home. Get someone from the audience to go back to your room. If you do not have your own room, the two of you go to a hotel room. If the person you ask does not agree, continue asking. Ask each and every person in the audience until someone agrees. Once you find someone, leave Monohouse with them immediately. The performance finishes when the two of you arrive back in your room. This score, like the others, is open for interpretation and can be performed as a private action without any clear audience awareness. So too could it be an ostentatious and occupy a point in between the two and shift in terms of its level of visibility. This is all up to the performer. Indeed, it might be accomplished most successfully if it were performed unannounced and informally. This brings us to the dual meaning of the word performance as spectacle and performance as the measure of success in meeting a task. What's more, this also brings us to another double meaning. Did you score? As for the event as a whole, scores gave it a type of formality that previous events often lacked. The event started with the presentation of the artists and then the shuffling and handing out of the scores. These were delivered in envelopes so that the process could be likened to the delivery of secret instructions. The first piece was inevitably the most chaotic. However, the event quickly settled into a rhythm. It never fell apart, and there was significant difference between all of the performances, which all used both the indoor and outdoor space. When performing outside, it also attracted the attention of passers-by. One boy, looking down from an upstairs window, even shouted, "Call the police!" The scores were made public 2 days after the event, and not on the same day as anticipated. This delay was added to allow the experience of the performances to settle in the memory and to then 2 days later to be re-evaluated in relation to the scores. This added information offered a deeper insight into each of the works as it made the contribution of the performer far clearer. It also became possible to see what they brought to the performance. At the same time, the piece could also then be understood as not only being the performance the audience had watched, but as being a score open to a far broader range of interpretations. Take the case of the performance of taking someone home. If this were enacted discreetly and thus without any audience awareness, the performance would only become readable through the revelation of the score and the activation of the memory of the performance absence during the latter part of the event. As it was performed more publicly, so the revelation of the score acts as a thought experiment and explanation for the performance's untypical behaviour. The sharing of the scores also had a further purpose. It was a way to create a more complete sense of the event for those, like you, who were not there. The more complete online representation helped build a greater artistic community of performance in Nanjing. It not only informs people what happened, it introduces a method of performance making that is unfamiliar to the local artistic community. LMLA has staged performance scores in other cycles of the group's activity too. It has been an important strand of the group's work as it enables LMLA to present international artists' work even though the group lacks the budget to bring them to China. House music and ghosts is a case in point. following an open call, a set of instructions were provided by Johanna Thompson and Ron Mayer, Berlin, Los Angeles, that essentially involved turning a room into a musical instrument by stretching piano wires between the walls so that the room acts as a resonant sound chamber. The wires are then played in a way that invited the participation of any ghosts present. To realise this, we had to first find an abandoned building that had a history. Specifically, we searched for a building that had been occupied by the Japanese during the Nanjing massacre. This placed the work in an awkward position, as belief in ghosts is officially prohibited as superstitious, yet it's nonetheless widespread. On the other hand, this particular history is local, complicated, and weaponized. One of our group is a historian who has written a doctoral thesis on this topic, and with his assistant we attempted to insert our event across and between competing narratives. We found a suitable building in the suburbs and made the concert secretly at night in candlelight. Again, we had a participant drop out at short notice, but we recruited the bass player of a local psychedelic rock band to join us. The performance was intense, and we found ourselves unable to speak for some time afterwards. Whether ghosts did or did not assist the performance is an open question, but the belief in their possibility certainly made a huge difference. Through this sort of scored international collaboration, LMLA is able to present work that does not ordinarily reach an audience in China. What is more, in the process of localizing the scores, the group makes a considerable effort to ensure the work is relevant to the local situation. Creative interpretation inevitably takes place, and the result is something that the proposing artist could not have imagined. I step back as much as possible and let the wider team take ownership of the process so that the work reflects contemporary Chinese tastes, while still remaining faithful to the spirit of the score. This sort of international artistic exchange is one where both sides have something to learn from the other. The final activity I would like to mention was a workshop on scored performance given in 2022. After having seen how the practice of scoring is unfamiliar, I decided to start teaching it more systematically through day-long workshops. Russian Roulette worked through harnessing an initial burst of energy, but if I were to reproduce the event, I might like to first work on scoring in the way we did in this workshop. That is to say, to perform and discuss classic scores and then move into writing original ones. I found scores to be a useful pedagogical tool as they take the pressure off concept creation, but still leave significant space for artistic invention and interpretation. Here I'm performing the score of Larry Miller's See You in Your Dreams with Chinese artist Liao Yingzi. The instruction is simply to appear in another's dream. I was told the following morning that the performance was a success. Summary. LMLA has made use of performance scores in several events, most notably Russian Roulette from 2019. The way in which scores were employed helped build empathy between audience and artist, and they also served as a pedagogical tool helping students and emerging artists to get started, to try new things and to get an exterior view of their own practice. Scores also served as a way to create a meaningful international exchange as they introduced foreign work to China while also localizing the work and developing the Nanjing scene. A final useful role scores provided was to build a wider and more knowledgeable audience for performance in the city. In all of these ways, scores have made a useful contribution and will continue to play a role in LMLA's activities.